Okay, so we'll get it started. Thanks everyone for joining us today. So for those that don't know, my name is Patrick Russell. I'm the co-founder and president of Vortex Group of Companies. Today we have an amazing guest speaker who'll be sharing some incredible insights on the Trump tariffs that we're all talking about right now. It's a topic that's on the top of everyone's mind. I'm sure you're all eager to dive in, so I'll keep it brief. But two quick things before we get into this. There's going to be time for questions at the end of the session. Some of you have already submitted questions, which is great. If you have any additional questions during the presentation, just enter them into the chat, and then we'll funnel those over to Mark. We'll do our best to address as many questions as possible towards the end of the seminar. But just before we begin, just a quick reminder, please mute your microphones, keep them muted. It's going to help ensure the best audio experience for everyone. Now it's my honor to introduce our distinguished speaker today, Marc L. Busch. So Mark is the Carl Landegger Professor of International Business Diplomacy at the M&A Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. Mark's an expert on international trade, policy, and law. He previously served 2 terms as a cleared advisor on technical trade barriers to the United States Department of Commerce and the United States Trade Representative. He has addressed a wide range of governments and international institutions. Mark's testified before the U.S. International Trade Commission and the House Judiciary Committee on several topics, including the WTO's TRIPS waiver, the House Aviation Subcommittee on Airbus Boeing litigation, and the Canadian Senate on softwood lumber litigation. Mark was on the NAFTA 2022 panel for best practices concerning dispute settlement. He has consulted to APCO Worldwide, Boston Consulting Group, Booz Allen Hamilton, Bell Canada, Canada Goose, DCI Group, Foreign Refiners Association, Frontier Strategy Group, Goruck, Health Canada, Janssen Pharmaceuticals, McKinsey & Company, Monitor Group, Nomacork, Philip Morris International, Pharmaceutical Research and Manufacturers of America, Sidley Austin, the Swedish International Development Corporation Agency, the United Nations, and the Trade Law Division of the Department of International Trade Canada. Mark has previously taught at both Harvard and Queen's University. In 2010, Forbes magazine named his course Business, Government, and the Global Economy one of the top 10 most innovative MBA courses in the United States. Mark's received his PhD and MPhil degrees from Columbia University, his Master's of Arts from the University of Toronto, and he received his Bachelor of Arts with honors from Queen's University. We're extremely thrilled to have Mark with us today. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Mark. And I guess my one question is, what has Jeremy done with his life? Go ahead, Mark.
Well,
thanks for joining us.
Right. Thanks for having me. It's great to be invited by my little brother to engage with you all on this important topic. I'm going to spend about 20 minutes on some slides, and then we'll get into your questions. So I'm going to go and share them with you right now. What I want to make clear is that Trump has a fundamental problem when it comes to delivering on his campaign promises, and the problem can be best expressed in 2 numbers. The first number is 2. That is the U.S. average applied most favored nation tariff. And it's a low number. It's why you keep hearing him talk about how every other country is unfair. The other number is half. That's the percentage of all U.S. imports coming into the country duty-free. So when you add those 2 numbers together, Trump is hard-pressed to deliver on his protectionist rhetoric. He has a very particular narrative that he has been rehearsing since his first term. And in fact, if you go back to the 1980s, he was rehearsing it back then as well in some commentaries he wrote on how Japan was eating our lunch. Now, Trump's problem is our problem, and I just wanted to give you one data chart because I find it frustrating that what happens in conversations about Trump's tariffs is that we so easily end up debating numbers. It's not the numbers per se. It's the uncertainty about what the numbers could be that is the secondary problem. And this graph demonstrates that. This is an index of trade policy uncertainty. And it's one of the key terms that needs to be discussed more in the media. Trade policy uncertainty. These data go back to the 1960s. And what's happening here is a measure of reporting, including in the media, on economics and trade and uncertainty. And if you look in the upper right corner, you'll see that under Trump's first term, trade policy uncertainty in the United States hit an all-time high. And there are three incidents driving that spike. One is a threat against Mexico, which actually more or less foreshadowed what just happened the past 48 hours. Another was the steel and aluminum tariffs. Get ready for those momentarily. And the other was the Section 301 actions against China. And as you all know, China has retaliated today for the US 10%. And in fact, word is that China and the United States are not having a conversation along the lines of what happened the other day between Mexico and Trump and Canada and Trump. So what I want to leave you with is that we're as concerned about trade policy uncertainty as any given number. 10, 20, 30, sure, these are big business problems. But it's the fact that we have moved away in the United States from any semblance of abiding by our WTO and USMCA tariff schedules that is an added problem, and one that will not be remedied by a 30-day ceasefire. Now, Trump, as you all know, is not eager to have Congress weigh in on tariffs. And I'm sure you all recognize that ultimately Congress has the purse strings when it comes to tariffs. So Trump only has a limited number of options in his toolkit, and I want to talk about them because they're things that should be on your radar. The first is that he's going to loosen the terms on trade remedies. These are going to be a big problem. They're getting attention, but they definitely should be. Under Trump's first term, he really pushed the Department of Commerce to ease up on the demands made of firms petitioning for anti-dumping duties, countervailing duties, and even safeguards. We're going to see a repeat of this. I'll come back to this momentarily when I talk about a particular methodology that Trump wants to essentially resurrect after a WTO loss a number of years ago. Second is Section 301. This is the basis in law for the China tariffs. This is a trade enforcement action. The problem that Trump has with Section 301 is that ultimately there's a statutory requirement that the tariffs be reviewed, and Trump really isn't interested in that. Moreover, the United States lost Section 301 at the World Trade Organization when the European Union filed against it in the late 1990s, which is why you didn't hear about it from about 1999 until Trump won. So Section 301 is going to be the tool that he uses to continue the tariffs against China that Biden had refreshed. But the new tariffs as of yesterday are going to be under IEEPA. I'll come back to IEEPA in just a second. So look for more Section 301 tariffs. We had 4 rounds under Trump 1.0. We had 1 round under Biden. Look for more. Section 232, this is the go-to. Trump is in love with Section 232. This was the basis for the steel and aluminum tariffs. Section 232 is a national security tariff. So the executive has a little bit of independence to run roughshod over Congress in instituting them. There were efforts under Trump 1.0 to rein this in. Congress wrote some bills to require that at a minimum, the Department of Defense certify that there was a national security issue on the line. We had a whole bunch of investigations under Section 232, everything from titanium sponge to mobile construction trucks. But everyone knows Section 232 because of the steel and aluminum tariffs. We'll come back to those as well. Then there's Section 338. We're expecting that Trump may show some interest in this, but it's going to be really hard to do this as a blanket across the board tariff. So Section 338 allows the executive to challenge a country that discriminates against the United States. It'd be hard to argue that every country on earth is discriminating against the United States, so that's the problem for a blanket tariff. But nonetheless, he can give it a try. All of this is subject to judicial review. And then there's Section 122 on balance of payments. For all those of you who wonder, why does he keep talking about trade surplus and trade deficit countries? Well, because he feels that anytime the U.S. runs a trade deficit, it's unfair. But it's also because he can set up Section 122. The question again, though, is it an across-the-board versus country-specific salvo that he could issue under Section 122? It's going to have to be a court that's going to make that call. And then finally, the one that you've all been waiting for, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. This is the legal basis for what he did in threatening Canada, Mexico, and China. IEEPA. It's an acronym you should all get used to hearing. IEEPA is a really weird bit of legislation. It actually was preceded by something called the Trading with the Enemies Act, which was a World War I vintage law. And it is nested within something called the National Emergencies Act, which is why Trump needs to keep talking fentanyl and illegal immigration. He needs a national emergency to use the tariffs. Here's the problem. No president has ever done this before. And there are real legal questions about whether or not he can issue any tariffs under IEEPA. IEEPA gets a lot of use, don't get me wrong. From Obama on through, they've all used IEEPA to sanction Russian oligarchs, for example. But that's a very precise definition of a national emergency, and the means ends calculation with respect to remedying that emergency makes sense. This would be very different. This is very different. Now, Trump believes that there is a precedent, and that's because President Richard Nixon did something under the predecessor legislation threatening tariffs when he pulled the United States off the gold standard. There are, however, reasons to believe that here in Washington, D.C., everybody's gearing up to go to court. And ultimately, the U.S. Supreme Court is going to have to decide whether, in fact, Trump has overstepped. Now, the blinking that happened yesterday, and obviously there's a little bit of a debate about who blinked first, Trump or Trudeau or Sheinbaum. No matter what the answer is, however, there is some speculation that Trump is being told IEEPA may be subject to judicial review sooner than he might like, and he'd better figure out Plan B in the very near offing. Now, this is the fact sheet that came out that gave way to the tariffs against Canada, Mexico, and China. And I just want to show you, there's IEEPA. And you can see that IEEPA is the legal basis. We didn't necessarily take the fact sheet seriously. To be real, the tariffs had to get reported in the Federal Register, among other places. So Trump can say a lot of things in his fact sheets, but there it was in black and white, IEEPA. We thought it was going to be IEEPA. It is IEEPA. And now we're going to have to go to court. I just want to assure you, no matter where you're viewing this session from, that there is sufficient anger here in the United States over what just happened. It is not as though this move was popular whatsoever. Here's the U.S. Chamber of Commerce the other day noting that tariffs are not the answer. And look at the language here. Chamber is calling out IEEPA as being unprecedented in this regard, won't solve the problems, and it will only hurt U.S. consumers and American supply chains. And look at this warning here. The chamber is deliberating on next steps. That means going to court and, as they point out, working more closely with Congress. So there will be domestic political pressure to rein in IEEPA because it is unprecedented. And it may not even serve Trump all that much longer, but this is where we are. Now, before I get into my 3 waves of tariffs, I just want to point out that we never got an executive order on trade on Inauguration Day. That is a misnomer. What we got was a memo, and here's the front page to the memo. And the memo called for a whole bunch of studies, almost all of which are due on April 1st. That's an important date to write down. April 1st is when every one of the agencies and departments are slotted to bring in their answers on an assortment of studies. I'm just singling out paragraph H here. This is a request by Trump that the Secretary of Commerce will review American trade remedies laws, anti-dump, countervail in particular. And what's clear and what is very disturbing is that Trump wants to resurrect a methodology on anti-dump called zeroing. This is a methodology that was struck down 3 consecutive times by the World Trade Organization. As you may all know, Trump doesn't really care about adverse rulings at the WTO. The rest of the world does, however. Zeroing is a mathematical gimmick. It reflects a belief that there is no such thing as a negative dumping margin. So what the Department of Commerce is supposed to do in making its calculations on anti-dump and countervail is to zero out negative dumping margins, which literally mathematically biases the review in favor of a dumping affirmative decision. So the U.S. loves it. And let me just mention, this is bipartisan love. This is not Trump. Trump has just expressed it in a way that no prior president has. I've spoken with general counsels at USTR on both sides of the aisle, and they all favor zeroing. Not because they necessarily believe that it isn't a mathematical gimmick, but that they never put it on the negotiating table when the World Trade Organization was getting negotiated. So, don't look for this one to go away anytime soon. And the bottom line implication for everyone on the call is this just makes it far easier to find that companies selling into the U.S. are selling below fair market value, i.e. they're dumping, in which case there's an offsetting tariff called an anti-dumping duty to make the trade seem fair. All right, I drew a little picture, and it's going to come in a couple waves. And you're going to get a headache when I'm done. So ask questions. Yesterday was wave 1. That was wave 1 of the tariffs. February 1st, wave 1, 25% Canada, 10% energy, 25% Mexico, 10% China. Chinese embassy refused to comment yesterday. They couldn't believe that it was Canada that was the main target, not them. Wave 2. You're not hearing about this yet. Jot down February 15th, maybe a little bit later for one item, copper. February 15th is the deadline for Trump's threatened tariffs on semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, steel and aluminum, and copper. Now, he hedged his bets the other day in a press conference. He said that he may have to wait a little longer for copper. The idea is that he wants to follow through on his belief that if he builds a high enough tariff wall, everyone will come to the United States to build whatever they're going to build. The problem is that on semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, but especially copper, there's no way that's going to happen. Nonetheless, we are expecting February 15th, maybe a delay slightly for copper. That will be wave 2. Wave 3, April 1st. April 1st because Trump isn't really waiting for the results of these studies. He just wants them as an excuse to follow through on whatever's coming next. whatever's coming next, odds are it's the EU. That's really what he's got his sights on right now. He wants the EU. Question is, what will that do, and how quickly will the EU retaliate? The EU has been prepping in wargaming scenarios for Trump's tariffs since at least August. We know what they've concluded in Brussels. Their answer is hit hard, hit fast, and get Trump back to the negotiating table. Now, I'm going to tell you something here that you're not hearing much about. In between the February 15th and the April 1st, right smack dab on March 31st, we will have an end to the ceasefire between the United States and the European Union on steel and aluminum tariffs. The expectation is that on March 31st, the two sides go back to their 2019 tariffs, which generally were 25% on all targeted goods, including alcoholic beverages. So interspersed between the brand new national security tariffs for February 15th and the results of the study April 1st, we will have the end to a ceasefire and largely the resumption of hostilities that go really, really deep. Now, I'm going to bracket all of this by saying, get ready for the trade remedies. Because the anti-dump countervail cases are already being submitted by firms here in the United States who remember Trump 1.0. I mean, my God, even Boeing used anti-dump countervail against Canada's Bombardier, knowing full well that everything was being green-lit. I got to tell you, there are DC law firms that right now will not take a case from a Chinese company trying to defend itself in an anti-dump countervail case because the law firms know they cannot win. They cannot win. This is political. So that is my snapshot of the tariff action heading into spring. It's going to be fast and it's going to be furious. And you can forget about this ceasefire as being a breath of fresh air. We're going to be at it again in a week and a half, and then again by April 1st, but probably before then, with the end of the ceasefire on steel and aluminum, US-EU. So let me end with, what can you do about all of this? My plea to all of you would be, huddle with a trade lawyer / customs lawyer. And the first thing I'm going to encourage you to think about doing is make sure you've got your tariff code right. It's time to look in detail at whether you've got the right 8 to 10 digit tariff code and whether you can try the old classic game of tariff reclassification by adding to or subtracting from something that you do. You might divide up something and do a little processing here and there. You might do what one of Canada's great entrepreneurial success stories did, Whoosh, which is a chemical used to clean your Mac computer. They added a washable towel, which made the chemical eligible to be qualified under U.S. Customs as a cleaning kit. So by adding something, you actually subtract it from your tariff code. This is a really great thing to be doing, and you're going to have to do it no matter what, because it's going to matter for how you defend yourself in trade remedies cases. Second, talk to your lawyers about a couple of other obvious items, and every law firm is selling their services at the moment on LinkedIn. First up is drawback. This is where you can draw back some of your tariff by virtue of exporting what you import, or you lose what you import. Then there's the idea of some kind of risk sharing built into your contract so that you and the importer split some of the risk of more tariffs. And finally, I can't believe I'm saying this in 2025, but it just shows you how old-fashioned Trump's protectionism really is. Think about finding your way to a free trade zone to do some of your stuff. because a free trade zone is not technically the country and maybe a way to get around some of the tariffs, no matter how fast and furious they come. These were largely obviated by all the free trade deals. But to work in a free trade zone on either side of the US-Canada border or US-Mexico side of the border, you may not be subject to these tariffs. Chat with your trade lawyer, your customs lawyer. Here's my main plea with respect to getting your tariff code right, and I'm going to make another plea. Get your data up and running. You're going to have to defend yourself real quick on anti-dump countervail. And the key is going to be know thy data, because you're going to get about 45 to 60 days to present to a government agency, Department of Commerce in the case of the United States, and they're going to take a look, and they can draw adverse inferences from your inability to deliver in a timely way these data. So make sure you've got everything ready in terms of your cost structure, and be really eloquent about what kind of profit margin you're talking about. No one's asking you to divulge business proprietary information. But again, huddle with someone who understands the petitioning process. The endpoint in this line here is about exclusions. What was really interesting about Trump's initiative this past 48 hours is that he vowed no tariff exclusions. We don't believe that will be true going forward. There's just no way. There's too much pushback in Congress. The trade associations are irate. And moreover, both Trump's Section 301 tariffs against China and all of his Section 232 steel and aluminum tariffs came with exclusions, by which I mean the importer files a petition for an exclusion based on the fact that they cannot get sufficient supply domestically, or they identify some other reason. And trust me, as someone who has looked at 355,000 petitions under Section 232, I can tell you, you need the data. You need to be able to tell your importer there are no other alternative suppliers in the US that can service them. But your importer is the one who files, not you. And you want to have this conversation as soon as word comes out that there will be exclusions. Next up, you're going to have to get political, because what Trump is going to do is a little different, especially if he actually doesn't do anything that looks like an exclusion. This is all going to be played in the halls of power here on Capitol Hill. And if that's how this game is going to unfold, you're going to have to lend some political support to your customers here in the United States. By that, I mean, you ask your representatives, Canada, Mexico, to contact their friends on Capitol Hill. This is going to be a lot of back channel letter writing, as it was for 301. And you're going to have to, once again, offer some data. You're going to have to demonstrate you're the only source. You're going to have to demonstrate, even if there are other sources domestically in the US, they cannot satisfy demand. And if your customer, which again would be the one filing the petition for an exclusion or walking the hill, give them a national security angle. Explain unequivocally, if your customer isn't buying from you, who are they buying from? Make sure that that story sounds like the only other action in town is China. And finally, this is going to be government to government to government. And that makes business feel a little awkward at times. So work through your trade associations, but make sure that the word is, this isn't doable for a set number of months. Give cost estimates, explain what this means in terms of the overall market, and don't ever isolate yourself in these narratives. It's really important to get clear to anyone who will listen in government that you are not you. You are an integral part of a value chain, an ecosystem, and that for you to lose customers is to actually bring that ecosystem down. That's a really important point to get across. Governments aren't terribly clever about business models, but they understand and listen to claims that far more jobs are at stake, meaning voters are at stake, when you are not just you are the linchpin for an ecosystem. So I'll stop my slides there, and I'll end with one final point, because I don't know how many businesses actually believe this, but it's desperately true. Governments love narratives. And the pro-trade people on Capitol Hill need a story that goes like this. There's a Virginia-based company. It's very entrepreneurial, and it imports parts of an engine from Canada. If it can't get those parts duty-free under USMCA, it will go broke. That will displace 15 employees and countless jobs in downstream distribution. That is the story that those on the Hill need most. It's also, by the way, what our negotiators like in terms of explaining the benefits of free trade. I have to tell you, having hosted several high-level meetings for our U.S. trade negotiators, for all the technical detail we get into with respect to the law, never once have our negotiators left without saying, can you give me a story? I need a narrative. I need a narrative that Vortex actually has 11 downstream customers, total job displacement sounds like X. No way that they're going to find anything new within 8 months' time. These are incredibly powerful stories. And the more you get your data together and these stories working together, the more effective you are in fighting for this stuff. That's my spiel. Happy to take your questions.
Thank you, Mark. That was very interesting. We've got a steady stream of questions coming in on email and chat. So maybe I'll start these off and then keep on sending them over. I guess one that we've had from a few different folks along the way is, can Congress or American businesses push back against these tariffs, and what are their remedies?
They can certainly push back, and they are. They're already pushing back. There are already big fights emerging in the Republican caucus. There are already trade associations going to court, and the domestic political pressure is boiling. You got a feel for that in the Wall Street Journal the other day, where the editorial team wrote that piece called "The Dumbest Trade War." That really clearly stung Trump, who then called the Wall Street Journal fake news. The pro side, in terms of the tariffs, no one. The anti-Trump side, no matter whether it's Republican or Democrat, everyone. This is not playing well, and it really looks like a self-inflicted wound. So the big effort, obviously, is to get this to court. This is uncharted territory. IEEPA is vulnerable. There's nothing about the IEEPA legislation that smacks of an across-the-board tariff. Doesn't mean that Trump couldn't fall back to something else, but it's definitely under political and legal pressure, and we've just seen the beginning of that. By the end of this week, I think we'll have a pretty good concrete sense for all the efforts to roll back the ability for Trump to do this again. And I should say, we've already had the Democrats in the House of Representatives table a bill that would ban the president and all future presidents from using IEEPA to institute across-the-board tariffs, and they name allies as being the no-go. So there's already legislative penmanship and while the Democrats obviously are not the party in power, you're going to see enough interest and enough concern on Trump's part to potentially scale back some of his broader ambitions.
Well, on that, I guess the next question is, what is the end game here? Like, what are those ambitions, and where would Trump like to see this all go?
You know, in the past 48 hours, I've heard everything from this is all to enrich Trump and Musk to this is all about sheer power grab to you name it. My view is that Trump's pretty transparent when it comes to economic policy. He has this very peculiar understanding of President William McKinley, who was in office in the late 19th century. And his view is that McKinley industrialized the United States behind a big tariff wall. And he wants to do the same thing. And so for McKinley, the rub in the story is that there were no such thing as income taxes at the time. So central budget revenue was a strict function of tariff revenue. And that clearly isn't true today. Today, tariff revenue is 2% of central budget. And Trump seems to have told himself this story enough. And I can tell you all that, having advised Harley Davidson, I was thrilled when Trump started using Harley Davidson as an example. And if you listen to some of his commentary on the campaign trail, it goes like this. Harley Davidson could sell motorcycles into India, but they'd be up against 100% MFN tariff if they did that. So instead, Harley Davidson builds motorcycles in India, and we call that tariff skipping foreign direct investment, which is what it is. And the story is true. Harley Davidson builds small bikes in India to do an end run on this tariff wall. What Trump gets wrong, however, is that Harley actually shut down its Indian operations because it couldn't draw with it the supply chains that it depends on. And what it did was it ended up moving to Thailand, which is now the 5th largest motorcycle producing country on earth, not because of a tariff wall, but because it has more free trade agreements than any country in the region. So if Harley builds a motorcycle in Thailand, it can ship that bike to China for 0 tariff. Whereas if you send that same bike from Pennsylvania, China's MFN tariff is 30%. So Trump has part of the story right. India definitely pursued tariff skipping foreign direct investment. The problem is that it backfired, so much so that now Thailand has a free trade deal with India. So the ultimate irony in Trump's misread is that nothing is built by Harley in India because Harley can ship from Thailand to India at 0 tariff as well as to China at 0 tariff. In fact, Harley can ship from Thailand to the EU at 0 tariff. That's what we should be doing in 2025, making the United States, kind of like Canada, an export platform, not hiding behind the moat and hoping that if you pull up the drawbridge, they will come.
Okay, there was another question asking about South Korea and India. Is there noise about incremental tariffs on South Korea and or India?
So South Korea is interesting because both Obama and Trump redrafted parts of the Korea-U.S. Free Trade Agreement from 2012. And the expectation is that Trump wants to do that again. The question is why? What would he get? What does he want? Now, in the old days, when Obama and Trump both did it, it was about cars and beef. We kind of have that solved, mostly, as much as it can be. To pick on Korea right now, it would likely be about Trump trying to pull troops out of South Korea or trying to get more burden sharing with South Korea. That's kind of where he was before. There's no reason not to think he would use tariffs to get that done. So sure, potentially a little bit of a sit down under threat of new tariffs, and you go from there. Could happen. India is a really weird case study right now. India is about the most protectionist country in the World Trade Organization and doing the most, minus Trump, to wreck it. And for all that's said and done, the speculation here in DC is that Trump and Modi may actually sign a free trade deal. Now, that's complete fabrication stuff, in as much as Modi has a free trade deal already negotiated with the European Union, and he just doesn't know how to bring it online. Modi doesn't want any big competition from a rich country exporting services in particular. So the only way Modi and Trump see eye to eye is if they write a really protectionist free trade agreement. That would be interesting because, funny enough, India is the #1 user of anti-dumping duties on earth. Maybe Trump and Modi can have a bonding session over anti-dumping duties. But other than that, it'd be really hard to get what the two countries would see as the benefit of that. What the U.S. wants in terms of a free trade agreement and the countries it wants it with, pretty short list. The UK is #1. And in terms of a deal that's in the can, ready to go, more or less, and could be valuable, politically, not economically, is Kenya. So those are the two that USTR has got to the point where they could be real, but neither is terribly exciting. You heard Trump the other day, he gets himself into trouble in these press conferences because he lashed out at the UK and then he realized, oh my God, I mean the EU, not the UK, but they're the same thing and they're both cheating us, so it doesn't really matter. But if he really does want the UK, and he did under Trump 1, and then Biden shut the door on any free trade deal with anyone, including the UK, which is why the UK then negotiated a whole bunch of free trade deals with US states. I mean, believe it or not, the UK has a weird trade deal with Texas. Now, Texas can't lower U.S. tariffs. That would violate the Constitution. But there is a lot of sharing of this, aspiring to that in the UK-Texas free trade deal. I think the UK now has 11 free trade deals with U.S. states. But no, India wouldn't make a lot of sense other than symbolism. And I think the world would infer the wrong lesson from the symbolism that these are two highly protectionist countries, that it's not really a free trade deal.
Okay, I think we're getting close to the end, so I'll just maybe end this with one last question. Most everyone on this phone call is particularly interested in US, Canada, Mexico trade relations. And so to put you in a completely unfair spot, where does this end up for Canada and Mexico? We talked about a March 1 date where there was more conversation. There's some studies coming back, but for people whose livelihoods depend on Canada, US, Mexico trade relations, where do you see this all going? The Wall Street Journal article yesterday or the day before saying the stock market believes this is just the art of the deal and these tariffs don't actually come in any meaningful way. But what is the advice from someone who does this for a living?
You work on the basis that what he's saying is what he believes. The honest truth is that he does want your business moving to the United States. Just putting it out there. He does. And he believes that you will be better off if you do that. He will be better off if you do that. No two ways about it. But the reality is that the United States is at full employment, has no ability to absorb anything more, certainly has its own issues to deal with. And the Republican Party has to begin to prep for 2028. And somewhere along the way, there's going to have to be a rediscovery of a Reagan-esque outlook that embraces free trade and admires what we have to the north and the south. And we get back to something akin to what we had before. But the bad news is we're not going back to that status quo. It will never be that simple again. look for the United States to exact some more concessions from both countries. And the fact that Trump has been told by someone that Canada doesn't allow American banks to operate, that's an amazing insight. It's terrific that finally we're talking services, but it definitely goes to the point that he does want concessions, and I would wager that he will get concessions. The question, though, is can both Canada and Mexico make concessions in a way that helps them? First, I'm loving the Canadian discussion about doing something about supply management and dairy. Thank God. And I'm really loving the fact that Canadians are asking, should we be erasing interprovincial trade barriers as a way of offsetting the damage of the tariffs? Remember, Canada has 3 trade agreements inside of Canada. So, of course they should. So should every country. These are great things to be doing, and they would lend to concessions that Trump could declare victory on. Talk about Mexico. 90% of all patents taken out in Mexico are owned by an American innovator. Mexico promised in negotiating USMCA that they would staff a bureaucracy to do IP enforcement. They've done nothing. They have to do something. But again, to do that is to drive more manufacturing jobs in Mexico. It's a win-win. So my hope would be that as Canada and Mexico both audit the concessions that they're going to make, that they can make, they do things that are really a win-win. And Mexico has a lot to win by simply staffing a bureaucracy they promised under Trump 1.0. They need IP to drive manufacturing jobs in Mexico. Get the job done. Sheinbaum knows this. I met with her trade team in the summer. They're all aware of all these U.S. accusations. None of them are new. And I really do want to say, for everyone watching, Canada and Mexico are both on the watch list issued every year here in the United States for being among the worst violators of American IP. You want to make a concession? Win-win. Do something on IP. So it's great that all of a sudden Jim Balsillie and everyone, they're all pushing for Canadian entrepreneurship. They're all talking IP. That is a major concession. It would be a win-win, and it would get us not back to the status quo, but to a better future. And a better future for Canadians and Mexicans too. Again, this is not just pandering to the United States. I gotta say, Mexico has so much to gain from just living up to the terms of USMCA. Just staff the damn bureaucracy and allow us a one-stop online shop to file patents and to see who else is looking at the patents. Any modern country does this. It's time for Mexico to do it too.
28 people still on it. If you mind asking.
Okay, that was fantastic and gave us all lots to think about. Pat, did you have anything that you wanted to ask or add as we end this now?
No, I think it's good. I mean, I think I just wanted to, thank you again, Mark, for your time and your insight. I think this is super valuable for us and all the people on the call. So we appreciate your time, and I think it's great.
Pleasure. And just before we go, there's a question that Trudy is asking about rules of origin and HS tariff codes. I have rules of origin by HS tariff codes, so those aren't either or. And for everyone online who's in Mexico in particular, now is a good time to ask yourself, given that the rules of origin under USMCA are going to get more stringent no later than 2026, keep shipping under WTO rules. 80% of Mexico's exports to the U.S. are already WTO, not USMCA. So know thy tariff code. Rule of origin, separate question. And the preference that you get by meeting the rule of origin may not be worth the candle.
Sorry, I guess one more thing, Mark. It looks like, based on all the things I read off when introducing you, this is something you do? Can companies come to you and ask you for advice and consult with you, or how does that work?
Sure. Send me a note. Happy to chat.
Okay. So I guess Jeremy has your details. If anyone on the call needs some expertise, feel free to reach out to either myself or Jeremy, and we'll put you in contact with Mark.
Thanks very much, guys.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for attending.
Be
Thanks,
well.
everyone. Thank you.
Okay, see you next.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.